My son's family looks perfect, at least from the outside. My daughter-in-law is a respected university professor, intelligent and composed, the kind of woman who seems to balance her career and home effortlessly. My grandson, 7 years old, is the spitting image of his father, polite, bright, and full of promise. They have a beautiful house, a nice car, and what appears to be a comfortable life. But you know what beauty means nothing when you don't see what hides behind closed doors. That picture-perfect home of theirs is in truth a living hell, and the victim inside it is my grandson. I had to save him. If you want to know how I did it, stay with me. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing where my dear listeners are joining this journey from and when. If you see me sitting here trimming my lavender so calmly, know that only a few hours ago, I received a cry for help from my grandson, hidden in a trembling hand-drawn note. My name is Georgia Ellis. I am 67 years old, a retired city gardener in Charleston. My home is small, surrounded by wild daisies and lavender bushes I planted with my own hands. The scent of the flowers is the only thing that reminds me peace still exists in this world. For the past 3 months, I have not been allowed to see my grandson Aaron, 8 years old, bright as a morning bird. That ban came not from the court, but from my daughter-in-law, Delilah Warren, a university lecturer who believes she was born to teach others how to live. My son Cameron, a software engineer, stayed silent. He said nothing when she said I was too old-fashioned, that my simple house smelled of soil, that I embarrassed them in front of her colleagues. He simply lowered his eyes, afraid of losing the image of a perfect intellectual family. I didn't fight. I only wrote in my diary one sentence that day. They can take away my name as a mother or a mother-in-law, but they can never take away my love as a grandmother. The garden became my only companion. Each morning, I watered the lavender rose and whispered to the empty swing where Aaron used to sit. Sometimes I thought I heard his laughter carried by the wind, and I would look up expecting to see him at the gate. But there was only silence and the hum of bees. Still I waited. Love, when true, always waits. Until this afternoon. The sun was setting, and I was trimming the dead petals when I heard the squeak of a small bicycle stopping at the fence. I turned, and there he was, my little Aaron, his face flushed eyes wide with fear. Before I could speak, he pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand and rode off pedaling fast down the lane. My heart raced. I unfolded the paper and saw a child's drawing of a silver bird trapped in a cage with a purple mark on the arm of the figure beside it. My knees weakened. That was our secret sign, the one we used in our bedtime story, The Silver Finch. The bird in the cage meant he was trapped. The purple mark meant he was hurt. I called after him, trembling, and whispered the words I once taught him. Do you remember what Grandma taught you? It's time to put it into practice. He turned back, gave a tiny nod, and disappeared around the corner. From that moment, I knew. The quiet life I'd built among the lavender was over. A storm was coming, and this time I would not stay silent. I sat on the porch long after Aaron had gone, the folded drawing still trembling in my hand. My heart felt like dry earth after a storm cracked raw and heavy. I could not understand how my own son could turn his eyes away from something so wrong. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath it, love still lingered. No matter how much Cameron disappointed me, he was still the boy I once held through sleepless nights, the child who used to bring me wildflowers and call me his hero. That memory kept me from collapsing. Love for my grandson and pity for my son were the only things keeping me steady now. I wiped my eyes and forced myself to breathe. Fear would not save Aaron. Action would. I went inside and pulled out the old Nikon camera that had gathered dust since my retirement. My hands shook as I checked the batteries, adjusted the lens, and whispered to myself, "You taught your son to stand tall once, Georgia. Now it's time to remind them who raised them." That night I began to document everything, lights turning on and off too late, shouting behind closed curtains, shadows moving at odd hours. I wrote down dates, times, and details in a notebook lined with soil stains. They thought I was just an old woman pruning flowers. They forgot I spent 30 years in public landscaping, observing, recording, and surviving bureaucracy. I knew how to build a file that no one could ignore. I spoke quietly to myself as I worked. They think I am just a gardener, but I raised them with discipline and wisdom, and I still remember how to protect what I love. Those words tasted like iron in my mouth, bitter but strong. The night breeze carried the scent of roses, and somewhere in the distance thunder murmured. I looked down at the drawing again, the silver bird in its cage wings pressed tight, and I closed my hand around it. The paper was warm from my palm, as if it carried the heartbeat of the child who drew it. Tomorrow, I told myself I would no longer wait. I would act. I would no longer let silence be mistaken for weakness. I looked up at the sky as a gust of wind swept through the garden, scattering rose petals across the steps. They fell softly one after another, like tiny red warnings of what was to come. I took out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at one name I hadn't called in years. Ryder Cole, the man who once helped me fight for the land my husband left behind. I pressed call. His voice came through the line, calm and familiar. "Georgia, long time no see." I swallowed hard and said, "Ryder, I need to meet you. Not about the land this time. It's about my grandson." I wasn't always the woman people now call the quiet gardener on Lavender Street. Years ago, I wore the city's green uniform and tended to the public parks of Charleston. My job was simple but honest. I shaped trees, planted flowers, and learned the rhythm of nature better than the rhythm of any clock. When my husband died suddenly from a heart attack, Cameron was only 10. I remember that morning as if it were carved into my bones. The kettle still whistled on the stove, the neighbor's dog barked, and I was left standing in a silence so sharp it could cut through air. From that day, I promised myself one thing: I would raise my son to be strong and good, even if it meant working until my hands cracked. I took every job I could find. Landscaping, trimming hedges, planting gardens for families far wealthier than us. Cameron grew up helping me carry soil and watering cans after school. He used to ask Mom, "Do people notice when the flowers bloom?" And I'd tell him, "Maybe not, but they always feel better because they do." It was my way of teaching him pride in unseen work, the kind that builds character more than wealth. And for a while, he believed me. When Cameron became the first in our family to go to college, I sold my old wedding ring to help pay his tuition. I was proud. I thought I had succeeded. He graduated as a software engineer, moved to a new part of the city, married a university lecturer, and started talking about art galleries and imported wine. I visited them sometimes, always, bringing something homemade, cookies or flowers from my garden. But I noticed the shift. The house smelled like expensive candles instead of dinner. The laughter was quieter, colder. Delilah. My daughter-in-law never said anything cruel directly, but her tone was always dipped in sugar and ice. "Georgia, you still keep all those tools in your car. How quaint." Or, "You're amazing, really. I could never live so simply." Cameron laughed awkwardly, each time eyes darting toward her, as if asking for approval. My house, though, small, felt warmer than theirs. It smelled of earth, lavender, and cinnamon tea. I had little, but I was at peace. until Delilah decided my simplicity was an embarrassment, something that didn't fit her idea of a professor's family. That was when the distance began. What I didn't know then was that pride, when it grows unchecked, can turn into cruelty. And in the end, it wouldn't just break her, it would break my son too. Cameron always wanted to prove he had made it. Success to him was no longer measured in kindness or stability, but in the shine of a new car or the zip code printed on his mail. He bought a house in one of Charleston's most polished neighborhoods where lawns were trimmed by professionals and no one ever hung laundry outside. When I first visited, he gave me a tour as if it were a museum. He talked about the smart lighting system, the imported marble countertops, and how his neighbors were lawyers, professors, and doctors. I smiled politely, though every polished surface felt colder than stone. It wasn't the house I was proud of. It was the man I once hoped he'd be, Delilah Warren. His wife was the kind of woman who drew attention wherever she went. Beautiful, clever, perfectly put together. She lectured in literature at the university and loved quoting Shakespeare in casual conversation, as if to remind everyone she lived in a higher realm of intellect. Her charm worked on most people, but never on me. There was something sharp beneath her smile, something that looked down on the dirt under my nails. I was the gardener, and in her mind that meant I didn't belong in her perfect little world. She once told Cameron, not knowing I was standing nearby your mother's suite, but she represents everything I work to escape. That sentence lodged itself deep in my chest. I didn't cry. I just went home, washed my hands until the smell of soil returned, and reminded myself that dignity doesn't need applause. Each visit after that became an unspoken battle. She'd greet me with a tight smile, her perfume thick enough to hide the scent of dinner. Georgia, she'd say, you're always so thoughtful to bring flowers, but you know the neighbors here aren't used to the smell of garden soil. Then she'd laugh softly, like it was just a joke. Cameron would pretend not to hear, sipping his coffee and staring at the floor. I could see the shame flicker across his face, the kind that doesn't come from guilt, but from pride. He wanted me to be someone else, someone who fit better beside his polished wife. Delilah liked hosting dinner parties where every napkin matched the curtains and every guest spoke in academic tones. When I came, she'd place me at the end of the table between the children or near the kitchen door. I didn't mind. I'd rather be near the warmth of food than the chill of conversation. Still, I could feel their eyes on me, curious, polite, but distant. They lived for reputation. Appearances were their religion, and authenticity was their sin. And while I smiled and nodded, a small part of me wondered how long such a perfect surface could hide the cracks underneath. It was Aaron's 8th birthday, and I remember the day as clearly as if it were still unfolding in slow motion. The house was decorated like a magazine spread balloons tied with satin ribbons, a dessert table gleaming under perfect light, and music playing softly in the background. I arrived with a tin of cookies I had baked that morning, and a bouquet of pink roses from my own garden still damp with dew. They weren't expensive gifts, but they carried love in every detail. When Delilah opened the door, her smile was polished but hollow. She looked at the cookies, then at me, and said lightly, "Mother Ellis, you really shouldn't have gone through all that trouble. You could have just let the catering service handle everything." Her tone was honey mixed with vinegar. I smiled anyway and placed the cookies on the table next to the glossy store-bought pastries. The guests, mostly her university colleagues, were polite but uneasy. A few of them took a cookie out of courtesy. One woman murmured, "These are actually quite good," and everyone else smiled thinly, the kind of smile that hides judgment behind politeness. Cameron stood near the drinks table, avoiding my eyes. I noticed the red creeping up his neck, the same color he used to get when he lied as a child. I tried to focus on Aaron instead. He ran toward me, hugged my legs, and whispered, "Grandma, you brought the flour cookies." His joy was the only real thing in that entire room. But joy doesn't last long when pride is nearby. Delilah called Aaron over, fixing his shirt collar with that tight, performative smile. "Sweetheart, go play with your friends. Grandma's cookies might get your hands sticky." The guests chuckled softly. I pretended not to hear. I stood by the window looking out at the garden that had been professionally designed, symmetrical, lifeless, and perfect. My own roses felt more alive than that entire yard. When the cake was served, they didn't use mine. Delilah's assistant brought out a 3-tier fondant cake with the child's name in gold. Cameras flashed. I clapped along and whispered to myself, "As long as he's happy." But even then, I saw Aaron's eyes searching for my simple cookies. That night after the guests left, I heard their voices through the thin walls of my home. Cameron had called. His tone was cold, rehearsed. "Mom, Delilah thinks it's better if you give us some space. You made her uncomfortable tonight. She said it felt embarrassing." I sat there in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my son choose appearances over his own mother. When the line went dead, I looked down at my hands, still dusted with flour. The same hands that raised him, fed him, and built his future. And now they were seen as shameful, unfit for the table of his new world. I blew out the candle on my kitchen counter, whispered a quiet happy birthday to Aaron, and promised myself that someday he would know which kind of love truly lasts. Before everything fell apart, Aaron used to come to my house every Saturday morning, his little backpack bouncing on his shoulders. Jasper barking at the gate as if welcoming royalty. He loved that dog, the way Jasper would wag his tail and spin in circles until Aaron dropped his school bag and threw himself into the grass. My home wasn't large, but to Aaron it was a kingdom. The air smelled of lavender and baked bread, and he'd always say, "Grandma, it smells like sunshine here." I never corrected him. Children should keep their poetry. We had a routine. After breakfast, we'd go into the garden and he'd help me water the roses with a small green can. I would tell him stories while he worked, the same stories I used to tell his father when he was small. But his favorite was always the silver finch. I made it up years ago about a bird with silver feathers that would only sing when it saw someone truly kind. If it sensed lies or cruelty, it went silent, waiting for truth to return. Aaron listened with wide eyes every time. He'd ask Grandma, "How does the bird know who's good?" And I'd answer, "Because kindness has a sound, my dear, and the heart always hears it first." Sometimes, after stories, he'd curl up next to Jasper and whisper secrets into the dog's ear. I never asked what they were. Children need a place where words are safe. My garden was that place for him. There no one shouted. There were no slammed doors, no tense voices through thin walls, just the wind, the bees, and his laughter echoing between the rows of flowers. One afternoon while we were baking cookies, he said something that froze me. "Grandma, when I'm here I can breathe. At home I can only listen to Mommy yell." He said it so casually, like it was simply the way life worked. I smiled to keep him calm, but inside, I felt something break. I reached across the counter, brushed a bit of flour from his cheek, and said softly, "That's why Grandma's house will always be your breathing place, okay?" He nodded, happy, and went back to rolling dough. That night after he left, I sat by the window with Jasper at my feet. The moonlight touched the toys he'd left behind, a wooden bird painted silver with one broken wing. I traced it with my finger and whispered, "The finch only sings when it feels safe." I didn't know then how true those words would become, or that they would one day be the signal that saved his life. After Aaron's birthday, silence settled between our homes like a locked gate. My calls went unanswered. The cheerful ringtone I used to hear when Delilah picked up was replaced by a cold, automated voice telling me the number was unreachable. I tried again the next morning, then the next, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't. A week later, when I went to Aaron's school to surprise him, the receptionist gave me a polite but uncomfortable smile. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ellis," she said softly. "We've been instructed that only the parents can pick him up." Her eyes darted away as if she couldn't bear to see the confusion on my face. On the walk back home, I called Cameron. His voice was flat, careful. "Mom, don't take it personally. Delilah's just under a lot of stress lately. You know how she gets." I stopped in the middle of the street, gripping the phone so hard my hand shook. "Stress doesn't mean cruelty, Cameron," I said quietly. "And since when does a mother need permission to love her grandson?" He sighed, but said nothing. There was a long pause, long enough for me to hear his guilt through the silence before he murmured, "Mom, please don't make things harder." Then he hung up. That night I sat on the porch with Jasper resting his head on my lap. The crickets sang, the lavender swayed in the breeze, but the peace that usually comforted me felt hollow. Every memory of Aaron, his laughter, his drawings, the way he'd run barefoot through the garden, played in my mind like an old film. I told myself to be patient. Maybe time would soften Delilah's pride. Maybe Cameron would remember the values I'd once taught him. I convinced myself that patience was a form of love. Weeks passed. The flowers bloomed and wilted. The mail came and went. But there was no knock at the door. No small voice shouting, "Grandma, I'm here!" I started baking cookies on Saturday mornings out of habit, setting them aside in a tin that no one came to open. Each evening, I wrote the same line in my diary. "Love doesn't fade, but distance makes it ache." I didn't know that the next time I would see Aaron's handwriting, it wouldn't be in a thank you note or a crayon drawing. It would come folded into a secret, trembling message, a desperate call for help. The kind of message no child should ever have to write. After I received that drawing, nothing around me looked the same again. Every morning I walked past Cameron's house under the pretense of going to the market, but really I was listening. The windows, once wide open to let the smell of their coffee drift out, were now always shut tight. Curtains drawn. Silence where Aaron's laughter used to spill across the street. The garden toys that once scattered the yard had vanished. It was as if someone had erased all signs of a child from that house. Neighbors began to notice too, though most were too polite or too afraid to say much. One afternoon, while pruning roses near my gate, Mrs. Hargrove, who lived across the street, leaned in and whispered, "That little boy of your son's. I hardly see him outside anymore. And the other night I thought I heard someone yelling, a woman. It sounded bad." Her words hit me harder than she knew. I thanked her and pretended to keep trimming, but inside my heart was pounding. That night, I sat by my window notebook, open pen ready. When the clock struck 8, a faint sound carried through the air, a sharp, angry voice. Delilah's. It came in bursts, then silence, then another burst, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry. I looked at the clock and wrote the time, 8:17 p.m. My hand trembled slightly as I drew a small circle beside it. Evidence, I told myself, not emotion. If I wanted to save Aaron, I needed proof, not tears. For 3 nights, I listened. I marked every outburst, every slammed door, every flicker of light turning off too late. I was no stranger to hard work, but this kind of labor, watching helplessly, was the hardest of my life. On the 4th night, I couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. I picked up the phone and called Ryder Cole. His voice was steady, professional, yet warm. "Georgia, what's going on?" I hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Ryder, I think something's wrong in my son's house, my grandson. He sent me a drawing. It wasn't just a picture, it was a message." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you saying you suspect abuse?" I don't want to believe it, I said. But my heart tells me the truth before my mind can. He sighed, then his tone shifted to firm and clear. Listen to me carefully. You'll need to document everything, times, dates, any witnesses. That's what Child Protective Services calls pattern evidence. Once we have enough, we can file a report properly. No guessing. No accusations without record. That's how we protect him. I wrote down every word he said. When I hung up, I stared at my trembling hands and whispered to myself, "So be it." From that night forward, I was no longer just a grandmother. I was Aaron's witness. The following Monday, I went to Aaron's school. The air smelled of chalk and disinfectant, and children's laughter echoed faintly through the hallways, sounds that should have comforted me, but didn't. I asked to see Melissa Green, his homeroom teacher, and the school's child psychologist. When she greeted me, I could tell she already sensed something was wrong. Her voice was soft, cautious. "Mrs. Ellis, is everything all right with Aaron?" We sat in her small office walls covered in drawings and motivational posters. I folded my hands in my lap and spoke carefully, trying to keep my emotions steady. "Ms. Green, I don't want to cause trouble. But if my grandson ever says he's afraid or mentions being hurt at home, you have a legal duty to report it to Child Protective Services. You know that, right?" She nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am, that's part of my job. But has Aaron said something to you?" I hesitated, then handed her a folded copy of the drawing he had given me, the silver bird trapped in a cage. "He didn't use words. He used this." Her eyes softened as she studied it. She didn't say much after that, just promised quietly, "I'll watch him closely, Mrs. Ellis." For the next few days, I barely slept. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt. I watered the garden, baked bread, tried to keep busy, but every thought circled back to Aaron. What if Delilah found out I'd spoken to his teacher? What if she punished him for it? The fear of that possibility pressed on me like a stone. Then 4 days later, my phone rang while I was in the garden. Melissa's voice was urgent, but steady. "Mrs. Ellis, I think you should come in. Aaron drew something in class today." When I arrived, she showed me the new picture. It was a house with heavy doors, and across them thick chains sketched in black crayon. In the small window above, a boy's face peered out, his mouth just a straight line. My hands went cold. "This isn't a fantasy drawing," Melissa said softly. "This is disclosure. In child psychology, that's what we call it when a child communicates trauma through art." I felt tears sting my eyes. "What do we do now?" "I've already called the local authorities," she said. "It's indirect evidence, but combined with your statement, it's enough for CPS to open an investigation." I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to breathe. "Thank you," I whispered. "You may have just saved his life." As I left the school, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind that promised rain. I looked down at the drawing once more before tucking it carefully into my bag. The chains on that door might have been made of crayon, but I knew the fear behind them was real. And from that moment, I promised myself no matter what storm was coming, I would break those chains. Delilah showed up at my doorstep 2 days after the school report was filed. Her car screeched to a stop in front of my house, and before I could even step outside, she was already marching up the path, heels clicking like gunfire on the stone walkway. She didn't knock. She burst through the gate, face flushed, eyes blazing with fury. "You're destroying my family," she shouted, her voice cutting through the quiet garden. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You made the school file a report. Do you want to see us humiliated in front of everyone?" I didn't rise to meet her anger. I stayed seated on the porch, pruning shears still in my hand, the scent of lavender thick in the air. I looked at her, calm but steady. "If you have nothing to hide, Delilah," I said softly, "then no one can destroy your family." Her mouth twisted. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You've poisoned my son against me." I raised my eyes to meet hers. "Your son is afraid of you," I said quietly, and that fear didn't come from me. That was when Cameron arrived. He must have followed her because his car pulled in just minutes later. He got out looking pale, nervous, as if he'd been dragged between two storms. "Mom," he started lifting his hands as though to calm us both. "Let's not do this. Please." Delilah turned on him, voice trembling with rage. "She's the one who called the school. She's trying to take Aaron away from us." Cameron's face turned red. He looked at me helplessly. "Mom, don't make this a big deal. Delilah's just strict. She doesn't mean harm. Sometimes kids exaggerate. It's just discipline." Those words pierced me deeper than any insult Delilah could throw. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My son, the boy I had raised with such care, taught right from wrong, was now defending cruelty in the name of discipline. I looked at him, searching for a trace of the child who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a snail. But that boy was gone. I stood slowly, my voice low but firm. "Cameron, when you were Aaron's age, I worked 2 jobs so you'd never have to be afraid in your own home. And now you're telling me fear is part of raising a child." He looked down ashamed, but said nothing. Delilah grabbed his arm and hissed, "Let's go. We don't need to listen to this." They turned to leave, but before she stepped through the gate, I said one last thing, my voice calm and cold. "If what happens in your house is truly love, Delilah, then you have nothing to fear from the truth. But if it isn't, then the truth is already coming for you." The gate slammed. Silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. Final. And as I looked toward their car, disappearing down the street, I knew the truth. I dreaded most. Aaron wasn't safe. It happened on a Thursday night, one of those humid Charleston evenings when the air feels too heavy to breathe. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed with an anonymous message. No name, no subject, just a video file and 4 words. "You need to see this." For a moment I hesitated. Then I pressed play. The video was shaky, clearly taken from a neighbor's phone, the camera peeking through a fence. It showed Delilah's backyard. The porch light flickered as she stormed out the door, dragging Aaron by the arm. His small body stumbled to keep up his cries, faint but distinct. She shouted something I couldn't fully hear, only catching fragments. Ungrateful embarrassment. "Stay quiet." Then in one swift motion, she shoved him to the ground. The sound of his sobs cut through me like broken glass. I froze. My first instinct was to rush over to confront her right there and then. But something inside me, some colder, wiser part, held me back. Emotion was a weapon she wanted me to use because it could make me look irrational. But proof could break her armor. My hands trembled as I replayed the video, forcing myself to watch every second. Each frame burned into my mind, but I knew I couldn't let rage blind me. I saved the file, uploaded it to my cloud drive, and made 3 backups, one on my laptop, one on an external drive, and one sent directly to Ryder. Then I texted him, "I have something. It's time." He called back within minutes. "Georgia, what is it?" I could barely speak. "It's a video, Ryder." She heard him. Someone recorded it. There was silence for a few seconds. Then his voice came low and firm. "Listen to me, Georgia. Don't confront her. Don't go near that house. We don't act with tears, we act with evidence. That's how we win." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I understand," I whispered. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The sound of Aaron's crying still echoed in my ears. Jasper lay beside my chair, sensing my turmoil, his warm head on my knee. I stroked his fur and whispered, "We're going to bring him home, Jasper." But not with anger, with truth. The night stretched long after that, the kind of silence that hums with tension. Above me, thunder rolled faintly across the sky. It wasn't rain yet, but I knew the storm had begun. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table long before sunrise, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and lavender from the open window. The video still played in my mind frame by frame, the shove, the cry, the silence that followed. I couldn't just wait anymore. It was time to act. I opened my old laptop, the one Aaron used to play games on when he visited, and began typing my statement for Child Protective Services. My hands shook, but my thoughts were clear. I described everything: how Aaron's laughter had disappeared from the yard, the neighbors' accounts, the drawings he made, and now the video proof. I attached the file along with the first drawing of the silver bird in its cage. Before hitting send, I whispered to myself, "For you, my little finch, you will sing again." Then I called Ryder. He answered before the second ring. "Georgia." "It's done," I said quietly. "The report is filed. I included the video and the drawings." "Good," he replied. "Now send everything to me. I'll prepare the official petition for the court." By noon, he called back. "I've filed a petition for emergency investigation with the Charleston County Court. CPS will move quickly once it's reviewed. Be ready, Delilah and Cameron will be notified." I thanked him and hung up, my heart pounding. There was no turning back now. The wheels of justice had begun to move. 2 days later, I watched from my porch as an unmarked car pulled up to their house. 2 officers and a CPS investigator stepped out. I could see Delilah at the window, her posture rigid, her chin high. She opened the door with that same artificial smile she used at dinner parties. Cameron stood behind her, his arms crossed like a man pretending he was in control. Even from a distance, I could feel the disdain radiating off them both, as if decency was something beneath them. But arrogance doesn't stop the law. Later that evening, Ryder called again. "They've been officially summoned. CPS will conduct home visits and interviews. The court wants this handled urgently." "You did the right thing, Georgia." I looked out toward their house, now dim and silent. "Doing the right thing doesn't feel peaceful," I said. "It rarely does," he replied. "But peace isn't the goal, safety is." After the call, I sat alone on the porch, the night air cool against my skin. Jasper lay at my feet, restless, sensing the tension. I reached down to stroke his head. "It's starting, Jasper," I whispered. "The storm's finally here." But this time, justice won't forget the old woman with dirt on her hands. In the quiet that followed, I could almost hear the faint echo of a bird's song in the distance. Soft, fragile, but free. It happened faster than anyone expected. 2 days after Ryder filed the petition, Child Protective Services arrived at Delilah's house with a local police officer. It was an unannounced visit, the kind that knocks the air out of people who think they're untouchable. I wasn't there, but I learned every detail from the report later, and I could picture it all as if I had stood right on their porch. The doorbell rang at 9:12 a.m. Delilah answered in her silk robe, hair still damp, face frozen between surprise and irritation. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp and defensive. The woman from CPS, Ms. Alvarez, held up her badge calmly. "We're here for a wellness check on Aaron Warren. May we come in?" Behind her, Cameron appeared still in his work clothes, confusion written all over his face. "What's going on?" he muttered. But Delilah cut him off. "It's a mistake," she said quickly. "You can't just show up here without notice." Ms. Alvarez smiled politely. "Actually, ma'am, that's exactly what we can do." They walked through the house, clipboard in hand, noting the silence that hung in the air. When they asked to see Aaron, Delilah hesitated for a moment too long before calling him down. The boy appeared at the top of the stairs, small and pale, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and his mother. On his right arm was a faint purple bruise, the kind that didn't come from a playground fall. Ms. Alvarez knelt down to his level. "Hi, Aaron. Did you hurt your arm?" Aaron opened his mouth, then looked at his mother. She took a step forward, voice tight. He fell at the playground last weekend, but the boy flinched when she moved closer. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible, but enough for everyone in that room to feel the truth vibrate in the silence. The officer exchanged a glance with Ms. Alvarez. "We'll need to verify that story," he said. Delilah's smile twitched. "Of course. I can call the other parents who were there." But they already knew. The CPS team had pulled security footage from the neighborhood cameras that morning. No car had left their driveway that entire weekend. There had been no playground, no accident, just another lie, dressed up in polite words. When the visit ended, Ms. Alvarez thanked them for their cooperation and stepped outside. The officer followed typing notes into his tablet. Inside the house, Delilah slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. Cameron stood in silence, pale and shaken. And upstairs, Aaron sat on the edge of his bed, tracing a small silver bird he'd drawn on a scrap of paper, whispering so softly that no one could hear "Grandma will come soon." Within 24 hours of the CPS visit, Delilah did what people like her always do when cornered. She went online. Her post appeared on Facebook first, a long, self-pitying letter titled, "When Family Turns Against You." The photo showed her with Aaron smiling stiffly in the park, months earlier, as if that frozen image could erase the bruise on his arm. "My mother-in-law," she wrote, "has fabricated cruel lies to take my son from me. She's old, bitter, and obsessed with control. Please pray for our family." By noon, the post had spread everywhere. Some of her colleagues at the university commented with sympathy, calling her brave and heartbroken. Others simply clicked the sad face emoji and moved on. But in the local Charleston community group, the reaction was different. One neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, wrote carefully, "I don't want to get involved, but I've heard shouting from that house several times." Another added, "I've seen the little boy alone in the yard at night." Slowly, the tone of the thread began to shift. I saw it all, though not from my own account. Ryder had warned me, "Don't engage, don't even log in under your name. They want you emotional, and we're going to stay factual." So I watched silently from a private browser, the words swimming on the screen. Each lie felt like a stone thrown in my direction, but I refused to throw one back. Instead, I wrote in my notebook, my pen pressing hard against the page. "In every storm, the calmest person is the one who already knows where the wind is blowing." The truth didn't need my defense. It had proof now. Proof doesn't panic. Proof waits. Delilah, however, couldn't stop. She went on local radio pretending to cry, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I've always respected my husband's mother," she said, "but lately she's been confused. She's trying to ruin our family because she can't accept that Aaron is growing up." It was almost impressive, the performance. If I hadn't seen the video, I might have believed her too. But real life doesn't bend to stories told for sympathy. That night, as I closed my diary, I looked out at the lavender swaying under the moonlight. I could feel the wind shift gentle but certain the way it does before a storm breaks. Somewhere deep down, I knew the storm wasn't against me anymore. It was moving toward her. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, tense phone calls and silent prayers. Ryder worked tirelessly collecting every thread of evidence that could hold weight in court. One evening, he called me with a tone that was both grave and triumphant. "Georgia," he said, "we found something." He explained that a nearby traffic camera, one positioned at the corner by Aaron's school, had recorded an incident 2 weeks earlier. The footage clearly showed Delilah standing by her car, shouting at Aaron in the open parking lot. Her voice was loud enough to be picked up by the camera's built-in microphone. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You think you're special because your grandmother loves you. You'll learn who's in charge." The words were sharp, venomous. Hearing Ryder recite them made my stomach twist. He told me he'd already filed the video as part of our evidence packet. "This isn't just emotional abuse anymore," he said. "This is public humiliation of a child. It changes everything. The next day, Melissa Green submitted her written statement to the court. She described Aaron's behavior in calm, professional language. The student often appears anxious and tearful, particularly at the end of the school day. He expresses distress when hearing the dismissal bell and exhibits hesitation when his mother arrives. Those words, clinical, yet heartbreaking, painted a picture no defense could erase. Together, the video and Melissa's report gave Ryder the final piece he needed. He filed a motion for an emergency removal order, a legal procedure allowing authorities to separate a child from an unsafe home without waiting for a full trial. I had read about such orders before, but never imagined I'd be the one begging for one. That Friday afternoon, the police arrived at Delilah's house with CPS officials. I stood at a distance on my porch, watching their car pull up under the shade of the oak trees. When the officers read the court order aloud, Delilah exploded. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice shrill. "That old woman will pay for this. You hear me? She'll regret ever interfering in my life." The words echoed down the quiet street. One of the officer's body cameras captured everything: her rage, her threat, her complete loss of control. Later, that recording would be added to the evidence file as proof of intimidation and emotional instability. As Aaron was escorted gently into the CPS vehicle, I caught a glimpse of his small hand pressed against the window. I didn't wave, not wanting to draw attention, but I whispered under my breath, "Hold on, my little Finch. Justice is finally listening." It was close to midnight when the knock came, soft, hesitant, but urgent enough to slice through the sound of the rain. Jasper barked once before I opened the door. 2 police officers stood there soaked from the downpour, and between them was Aaron, wrapped in a thin gray blanket. His eyes were wide, glassy with tears, and his little hands clutched the fabric like it was the only thing holding him together. "Mrs. Ellis," one of the officers said gently, "we're placing Aaron in your temporary care under the court's emergency order. He's safe now." Safe. The word nearly undid me. Aaron's lower lip trembled before he ran forward, throwing his arms around my neck. His body was cold, trembling, and I could feel his heartbeat pounding against my chest. "I knew you'd come, Grandma," he whispered, voice cracking. "I knew you'd find me." I fell to my knees right there on the porch, rain soaking into my skirt, and held him tight. My voice shook as I said, "The silver finch finally sang sweetheart. You did everything just right." Behind us, Ryder stood silently beneath his umbrella, his expression softened by the dim porch light. He'd come along to ensure the paperwork was signed properly, but for a moment, even the lawyer in him gave way to simple humanity. This, he murmured quietly to the officers, is the image the court will never forget. The younger officer nodded, eyes glistening. Then they both turned back toward their car, leaving us framed in the doorway, an old woman and a child clinging to each other while thunder rolled in the distance. I led Aaron inside, wrapped him in a warm quilt, and set a cup of cocoa in front of him. His hands were too small for the mug, so I held it with him, steadying his trembling fingers. He looked up, his voice a whisper. "Will Mom be mad at you?" I met his gaze, brushing the wet hair from his forehead. "Maybe," I said softly, "but sometimes people get angry when truth knocks on their door. What matters is you're safe." He leaned against me, the exhaustion finally overtaking his fear. As his breathing steadied, I looked toward the rain streaking down the window pane. For the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. Outside, Ryder closed his umbrella and stood for a while before driving away. The porch light reflected faintly in the puddles, turning everything silver, just like the bird in Aaron's drawing. That night, justice didn't roar. It whispered. And in that whisper, I finally heard hope. By morning, the story had already broken. The Charleston Gazette ran it first, a clean, clinical headline that sliced through breakfast tables across the city university lecturer and software engineer, under investigation for child abuse allegations. Beneath it, was a grainy photo of Delilah and Cameron, taken from a holiday post months ago. Two smiling faces that now seemed painfully artificial. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper spread open beside my coffee cup, and read every line twice, not out of satisfaction, but disbelief that it was finally public. Justice had stepped out of the shadows. Within hours, the neighborhood erupted. People who once waved politely at Delilah now crossed the street when they saw her. Mrs. Hargrove told me she overheard two women at the grocery store whispering, "Imagine lecturing about empathy in a university when you can't even show it at home." By noon, the university released a statement. Professor Delilah Warren has been placed on temporary leave pending investigation. The words sounded polite, almost delicate, but I knew what they really meant. Her reputation was gone. Cameron's company followed the same day. Administrative suspension without pay. The news reached him at the office. Someone leaked that he left mid-meeting. Face pale, eyes hollow. Late that evening, my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen, and for a long time I couldn't bring myself to answer. When I finally did, all I heard was quiet breathing, then the sound of my son crying. For a long moment, I said nothing. Part of me wanted to hold him to tell him it would be all right, but the truth was too heavy for comfort. "Cameron," I said softly, "your mother didn't do anything wrong. I only stood where the truth stood. I chose to protect the one who couldn't protect himself." He didn't argue. He just cried harder, the sound of a grown man realizing too late what silence can cost. After he hung up, I stayed on the porch, the phone still warm in my hand. Jasper rested at my feet, his head tilted as if he understood the weight of that call. Across the street, Delilah's house was dark curtains, drawn blinds shut tight. For the first time, it looked exactly like what it had been all along, a cage. Somewhere inside that silence, I felt both sorrow and relief. The storm had passed its peak, but the wreckage remained. Yet deep down, I knew one thing for sure: sometimes, the only way to protect love is to face its ugliest truth. Ryder came by the house early the next morning, carrying a leather briefcase and that calm, deliberate look he always wore when something serious was about to begin. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight falling through the lace curtains, papers spread between us like a battlefield map. His voice was low but steady as he outlined what came next. "We're filing for full legal guardianship," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "I've drafted the petition. It includes every piece of evidence we have, the CPS reports, photographs of the bruises, Melissa Green's written statement, Aaron's drawings, and the video footage from the street camera. Together, they form a complete narrative." I nodded slowly, tracing a finger along the margin of one document. My name looked strange, printed in bold type, like it belonged to someone braver. "And Delilah?" I asked. He sighed. "She'll fight it, of course. And she'll play the role she knows best, the fragile, misunderstood mother. The court will see tears, not rage. You have to be ready for that." "I understand," I said. "But I don't want her destroyed, Ryder. I only want Aaron safe." He looked at me for a moment, his expression softening. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what makes you credible. Compassion doesn't weaken your case. It strengthens it." He explained the process in careful steps. The hearing dates, the witness list, the psychological evaluation that CPS would conduct. Every line, every form had to be perfect. I watched him work with a kind of reverence. Ryder didn't talk much about justice in grand terms. He practiced it one signature at a time. When he asked for the drawings, I went to fetch them from the small cedar box in my bedroom. Each piece of paper still carried Aaron's faint pencil lines, the cage, the chains, the silver bird that always tried to fly. I handed them over, and Ryder slipped them gently into a folder. "These will speak louder than either of us," he said. Before leaving, he paused at the door, his tone turning more personal. "You know, Georgia, most people fight out of anger or pride. You're fighting out of love. The court can sense that. It always does. After he drove away, I sat alone with the lingering scent of paper and coffee. Outside, the wind rustled through the lavender, soft and rhythmic like breathing. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Justice is not about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent." And for the first time in months, I felt something like peace, the quiet kind that comes when you know the truth is finally on your side. When the headlines started spreading faster than we could keep up, Ryder came over one evening, his phone lighting up every few seconds with notifications. The story had escaped the boundaries of Charleston and was now on national talk shows, trending under hashtags neither of us ever wanted to see. "They're asking for interviews," he said, setting his phone face down on the table. "Local TV podcasts, even a parenting network. But I want you to say nothing, not a word." I frowned. "Won't silence make me look guilty?" He shook his head. "No, it'll make you look dignified. Let her talk. Let her spiral. Delilah is too angry to realize she's digging her own grave. Every time she posts, she proves our point that she's impulsive and vindictive. Your calm will do more damage than any press statement." So I stayed quiet. For days, I ignored reporters waiting outside the gate, their microphones reaching toward me like fishing rods. I tended the garden instead, clipping the lavender and pruning the daisies, pretending the world beyond my fence didn't exist. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, offering small nods of respect instead of gossip. Somewhere deep down, people were already choosing sides. Meanwhile, Delilah couldn't stop herself. She filmed teary videos in her living room claiming she was the real victim, that I had manipulated the system and stolen her child. Her hands trembled dramatically on camera, her voice rising and falling in practiced despair. The comments were divided at first. Some pitied her. Others didn't believe a word. But then came the video. It surfaced from a neighbor's security camera, the one that caught her dragging Aaron into the yard shouting. The clip spread like wildfire. News anchors replayed it, pausing at the exact moment she shoved him. On Twitter, someone wrote, "This isn't a grandmother lying, this is a grandmother protecting her grandson." The shift was instant. Social media, once divided, began to turn. Talk shows debated elder courage and maternal cruelty. Thousands of older viewers commented things like, "That woman reminds me of myself." Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it breaks your heart. Ryder called that night, his tone both calm and satisfied. "See what silence does," he said. "You didn't need to speak. The truth is speaking for you." I looked out the window, watching the glow of my neighbor's porch lights flicker through the evening rain. For the first time in months, the noise of the world didn't frighten me. It felt like justice was whispering through every comment, every headline, a quiet chorus saying what I didn't have to. The week before the hearing felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind where even the air seems to hold its breath. Ryder came to my house every afternoon, his briefcase heavier each time. Papers, photographs, transcripts, they spread across my kitchen table until the wood beneath disappeared. He was meticulous, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of fighting for the truth. "We've got the medical reports," he said one evening, sliding a folder toward me. Inside were printed photographs and doctor's notes. Multiple contusions repeated in similar areas over several weeks. That pattern alone tells a story one the defense can't explain away. I traced my fingers over the papers, my stomach tightening. Every bruise was a sentence. Every mark a memory of pain Aaron never should have known. "How can anyone look at this and still doubt him?" I whispered. Ryder's eyes softened. "They won't not when they hear the rest." He went on to explain that both Melissa Green and the CPS caseworker would testify. Melissa will talk about Aaron's drawings and his behavior at school. The CPS officer will confirm what they saw the night he was removed from the house. Together, their testimonies will give the court a full picture of what this child endured. I nodded, my throat dry. "He's just a boy," I said quietly. "He shouldn't have to carry all this." Ryder paused, then reached into his bag. "That's why I think we'll use this last." He placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed play. Aaron's voice filled the room, soft, shaky, but clear. "Grandma told me that when good grown-ups ask questions, I should tell the truth, even if I'm scared." My chest tightened. I hadn't realized Ryder had recorded that moment taken from the CPS interview, but hearing it now was like hearing a prayer. He let the tape play until the end, then shut it off gently. "This," he said, his voice low, "is what will silence the room. No lawyer can twist a child's honesty. When the jury hears this, they'll remember who this case is really about." I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the small recorder on my table. Outside, the evening light turned golden across the lavender field, quiet and steady, a promise of peace after the storm. And I thought to myself, when a child dares to speak the truth, the world has no right to stay silent. When the day of the pretrial hearing arrived, the courthouse in downtown Charleston felt colder than usual, its marble floors echoing with every step. I sat beside Ryder at the long oak table, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Across from us, Delilah looked composed, almost serene, dressed in a sleek navy suit, her hair pulled back with precision. She smiled politely at the judge, as if the courtroom were just another lecture hall. But Ryder had something she didn't expect. When it was our turn, he stood, his voice even, but firm. "Your Honor, before proceeding with testimony, I would like to present supplemental documentation regarding the respondent's behavioral history." He opened a folder and handed copies to the court clerk. "This record comes from the disciplinary office of Charleston University." Delilah's head snapped toward him, the first flicker of unease crossing her face. Ryder continued. 3 years ago, Mrs. Delilah Warren received an administrative penalty for striking a student during a class dispute. The report details her aggressive conduct and notes prior complaints of intimidation toward students. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge paused mid-note, adjusting his glasses. Delilah's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." That incident was unrelated and resolved internally. But Ryder didn't waver. It demonstrates a consistent pattern of violent behavior and loss of control, which is relevant when evaluating a child's safety under her care. The judge nodded slowly. "Overruled. The record stands." Delilah's mask cracked. Her breathing quickened, and her voice rose. "This is ridiculous. That student provoked me. It has nothing to do with my son." Her words echoed off the wood panels, sharp and panicked. The court reporter's fingers clattered on the keyboard, capturing every syllable. Cameras from the local press recorded the scene, her flushed face, her shaking hands, her desperate glance toward Cameron, who sat frozen in silence. Ryder remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Warren, please lower your voice," the judge warned sternly. But she couldn't stop herself. The composure she'd worn so carefully unraveled in seconds. By the end of the hearing, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The same people who once saw her as a victim now looked at her differently, wary, disillusioned. The judge turned toward me, his voice measured but gentle. "Mrs. Ellis, until the full custody hearing, you are hereby granted temporary guardianship and full protective supervision of Aaron Ellis." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded not from victory, but from relief. I turned toward Ryder, who simply gave a small nod, the kind that meant, "We did it, but stay steady." Delilah covered her face, sobbing her tears too late to save the image she'd built. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was blinding. I exhaled slowly, whispering to myself, "The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand." When the gavel struck for the final recess, the courtroom went silent, except for the rustle of papers being gathered. The judge had not yet returned to deliver the written ruling, but everyone knew where the wind was blowing. Reporters whispered near the back rows, cameras clicked softly, and even the air felt heavy with unfinished emotion. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, the scent of old wood and anxiety filling the room. Cameron stood near this bench, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. For a long time he didn't move. Then slowly he walked toward me every step, like an apology he had rehearsed 1,000 times, but never spoken. When he finally stopped in front of me, his voice broke. "I'm sorry, Mom." He couldn't look at me. His eyes were on the floor. I saw the same boy I once held through thunderstorms, the one who used to promise he'd never let anyone hurt me. Now he was a grown man who'd forgotten that promise until today. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "My son," I said softly, "some wounds don't show on the skin. They live here." I placed a hand over my heart. "And they never truly heal. But we learn to carry them." He nodded, his tears falling freely now. There was nothing more to say. Forgiveness wasn't instant. It was a process, a quiet rebuilding of something that had cracked but not shattered. Aaron tugged at my sleeve, then his small hand trembling. "Grandma," he whispered, "can we go home now?" I bent down and wrapped my arms around him, breathing in the faint scent of his shampoo, the warmth of a child finally safe. "The silver finch has flown out of the cage," I whispered into his hair. "You did everything right." For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my chest ease, not gone, but softened like a knot slowly loosening. As we stood there, the late afternoon sun poured through the high windows of the courtroom, casting a golden light across the benches. The rays fell onto the small leather notebook that lay open on the table, the one where I had written every note, every date, every small act of courage that led us here. On its cover, embossed faintly in silver, was the image of a finch mid-flight. The bird caught the light just right, glimmering a symbol of freedom of truth that could no longer be silenced. I took it in my hands and closed it gently. Justice, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply breathes. The courtroom was so still I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a mix of fatigue and tension that seemed to hang over every person in the room. Delilah sat at the witness table, dressed in a fitted black dress, her hair pinned neatly behind her ears. A box of tissues sat beside her, and she used it generously, dabbing her eyes as if each tear were a carefully timed performance. "I am a devoted mother," she said, her voice trembling in practiced sorrow. "I've always done everything for my child. This entire accusation, it's nothing but an attempt to humiliate me." Her lawyer nodded solemnly, as if her pain were sacred truth. But Ryder didn't move. He waited patient quiet, letting her weave her performance until the room was thick with her false sincerity. Then when the judge gave him a nod, he rose. "Your Honor." He said, his tone calm and precise. The defense's words might sound convincing, but I'd like to let the evidence speak for itself. He pressed a button on his laptop. The screen behind him flickered to life. The video began. There was Delilah on a bright afternoon standing in her yard. Her voice was unmistakable, cutting through the air like a blade. "You think you can talk back to me?" she screamed, yanking Aaron by the arm and shoving him to the ground. The audio captured the small cry he made when he fell. No one moved. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable, not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes when truth hits too hard. Delilah's face turned pale. She shifted in her seat, glancing at her lawyer who avoided her eyes. "That video is taken out of context," she stammered. He tripped. It wasn't what it looked like." Ryder's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "The footage is time-stamped and verified by 3 independent sources. It shows what it shows. Nothing more, nothing less." I sat there, hands clasped, eyes fixed not on Delilah, but on Aaron, who sat quietly beside the child advocate. He looked smaller than usual, but when our eyes met, I saw a flicker of courage, the same spark that once made him draw the silver finch. The judge's gaze swept across the room. The jury members exchanged glances, but said nothing. Even the stenographer's fingers slowed. The weight of truth filled the air, heavy and unspoken. Somewhere behind me, a teacher who had testified earlier whispered almost to herself, "That woman. She's a real grandmother." I didn't turn, I didn't smile. I only breathed steady and slow as the gavel tapped lightly on the bench. The truth was out now. It didn't need me to say a word. When Melissa Green took the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to shift. She wasn't a lawyer or a professional witness, just a young teacher in a simple cardigan, clutching a stack of drawings in her trembling hands. Her voice was soft but steady. "I've taught hundreds of children," she began, "but Aaron, he was different these past few months. Quiet. Careful. Like every word he said had to pass through fear first." Ryder nodded for her to continue. Melissa unfolded one of the papers and held it up for the court. It was a child's drawing done in bright crayons, a small figure inside a box, heavy lines drawn over it like prison bars. "He drew this in art class," she said. "When I asked what it was, he told me, 'That's me, when I'm at home.'" A few jurors looked away. One woman pressed her hand over her mouth. Melissa's voice wavered, but didn't break. "He also asked me something one afternoon after class. He said, 'If I tell the truth, will I get punished?' I didn't understand at first. But now, I do." The judge leaned back silent. Ryder stood, letting the moment breathe, before he spoke. "Thank you, Ms. Green. You've done what every teacher hopes to do, protect a child when the world fails to." Then he turned to the projection screen where images appeared one by one, photographs from the CPS report. Faint bruises on Aaron's arms, small and scattered, a darker mark near his ribs. The courtroom didn't make a sound. The click of the remote felt deafening. Ryder's voice filled the silence, calm but resonant. "We are not here to condemn anyone," he said. "We are here to protect a child who could not protect himself." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Across the room, Delilah lowered her head. Her mascara streaked as she wiped her face, but she didn't dare look up. The mask she had worn for months, the perfect mother the victim, had finally begun to crumble. Then from the bench behind me came the sound that cut through everything. Cameron's voice. It broke like glass. "Oh, God, what have I done?" He covered his face, sobbing openly, shoulders shaking. The courtroom turned toward him, some in pity, some in quiet relief. The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. Because in that moment, every person understood that justice wasn't just about evidence or law. It was about the courage to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Ryder stood adjusting his glasses with a calmness that made the room tense. The air in the courtroom had grown thick, heavy with anticipation. Everyone thought the worst was already behind us, but Ryder had saved the sharpest blade for last. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "I would like to present one final piece of evidence." He lifted a printed sheet from a folder and handed copies to the judge and the jury. "This is an email written by Mrs. Delilah Warren to a close colleague dated 3 months ago. It was retrieved legally through subpoena." Delilah froze. Her face drained of color as the projector screen lit up. The words appeared in large, unmistakable text. "Sometimes I wish the boy would just disappear so I could have my freedom back." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The kind that comes when people see something they can't unsee. Delilah shook her head, voice trembling. That was taken out of context. I didn't mean it that way." Ryder didn't raise his tone. "Then how did you mean it, Mrs. Warren?" he asked quietly. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her composure shattered. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she pressed her hands to her face. I was just tired. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean any of this. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the murmurs. Order in the court. His voice carried the weight of finality. He turned his gaze to Delilah. Mrs. Warren, your exhaustion does not excuse cruelty. Words like these reveal intent that aligns with every piece of evidence we have seen today. Delilah's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, sobbing, the sound raw and broken. Please, she whispered. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted peace. But peace had never been hers to demand, not at the cost of her child's safety. The judge's voice cut through the silence again. This court finds sufficient evidence of both physical and psychological abuse. Effective immediately. Mrs. Delilah Warren's custody rights are suspended. Temporary and full guardianship of the minor Aaron Ellis is granted to his grandmother, Mrs. Georgia Ellis. My breath caught. I hadn't realized I was holding it. Ryder placed a steady hand over mine, a quiet signal that it was done. Justice had spoken, and it hadn't shouted. It had whispered through truth, through patience, through every sleepless night spent waiting for this moment. Across the room, Delilah was still on her knees, mascara streaked, whispering apologies no one believed. I didn't look at her. My eyes found Aaron instead, sitting beside the advocate, small hands clenched, but eyes bright like he could finally breathe again. And for the first time in a long time, so could I. The story hit the news the very next morning. I hadn't even had time to make coffee when my neighbor Ellen knocked on my door, waving the Charleston Herald like it was on fire. Across the front page, the headline screamed in bold black letters, University lecturer loses custody after abuse allegations. Grandmother saves grandson with wisdom and love. I stood there still in my robe, staring at the words as if they belonged to someone else's life. Beneath the headline was a photo of me holding Aaron outside the courthouse, his small hand gripping mine. The caption read, Georgia Ellis, 67, steps up when no one else would. By noon, reporters had gathered at the end of my driveway. I didn't speak to them. Ryder had advised me not to, and truthfully, I didn't need to. The story had already spoken louder than anything I could say. The university released an official statement by afternoon. It was short, cold, and devastating. Professor Delilah Warren has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. The university does not condone any form of abuse or conduct unbecoming of our faculty. The words were clinical detached, the way institutions distance themselves from disgrace. Social media erupted. Clips from the trial circulated everywhere, the video, the drawings, the testimony. But it was the messages from older women that touched me most. They filled my inbox with letters and handwritten notes, some shaky, some typed in all caps, all carrying the same message. You reminded us that getting older doesn't mean getting weaker. It means getting wiser. One woman wrote, I'm 71 and raising my grandson after my daughter left. Watching you gave me courage to keep going. Another said, you made me believe that love, not fear, can still win. As I read their words, I realized the story was no longer just mine. It had become something bigger, a mirror for women who had been silenced too long, who carried the same ache, but never found the stage to speak it. In the evenings, I would sit on my porch with Aaron the cicadas humming around us and think about how strange justice could be quiet and fierce all at once. I hadn't set out to prove anything. I just wanted my grandson safe. But somehow, in fighting for him, I had become a voice for people I'd never met. Grandma Aaron said one night, his head resting on my arm, Are we famous now? I smiled. No, sweetheart, I whispered. We're free. When the storm finally passed, the house felt almost too quiet. The news crews had left the phones, had stopped ringing, and the world had moved on to its next story. For the first time in months, peace wasn't something distant. It was here, filling the air, like the scent of lavender drifting in from the garden. Aaron was outside, sitting on the old wooden swing beneath the oak tree. His voice carried through the open window, soft and bright, as he hummed the silver finch. That little song, the one I'd taught him when he was barely 5, floated back to me like a promise kept. I watched him through the glass for a while, the sunlight catching in his hair, his laughter rising every time Jasper, our old dog, tried to chase the falling petals. It was the picture of childhood, something fragile that had finally been returned to him. But even as I smiled, my chest tightened, because I knew what that freedom had cost. Cameron hadn't come home since the verdict. I heard from Ryder that he'd started therapy, that he'd moved out of their house and rented a small apartment near the river. He was trying, they said, trying to face the kind of guilt that doesn't leave bruises but burns just as deep. My son had lost everything he thought defined him: his home, his marriage, his illusion of control, only to learn what it truly meant to protect a child. I went outside, wiping the corner of my eyes before Aaron could see. He turned when he heard the door open, beaming. "Grandma, listen, the finch is flying again," he said, spreading his arms wide as if to prove it. I knelt beside him, brushing a leaf from his hair. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered. "It finally is." At that moment, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Ryder was there, his usual briefcase in hand, though he looked more like a friend than a lawyer now. He smiled faintly. "I wanted to check in before I head back to the office," he said. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "You didn't just save your grandson, Georgia. You saved your son's soul, too." I looked toward the horizon where the sun was dipping low, the light melting into gold. "Maybe," I said quietly, "or maybe they saved mine, because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs one old woman who refuses to stay silent." Ryder nodded, eyes soft with respect. Then he left me there, standing among the flowers, the evening air cool and forgiving. Aaron ran past me, laughing again, his voice carrying the melody of the silver finch into the fading light. And as the sky turned violet above us, I finally let my tears fall, not from sorrow, but from the quiet relief of knowing we had survived the storm together. Delilah disappeared from Charleston almost overnight. One morning, her house stood empty, curtains drawn, mailbox overflowing, the polished car gone from the driveway. The neighbors whispered that she'd left before dawn, that she couldn't stand the looks people gave her anymore. In a town like ours, silence is louder than gossip, and hers was deafening. The news stations moved on, but the internet never forgets. Every time someone searched her name, the same headline appeared: "University lecturer loses everything after child abuse scandal." Comment sections buzzed with judgment and pity in equal measure. Some called her a cautionary tale. Others simply wrote, "A mother who loved control more than her child." But the phrase that stuck the longest came from a local radio host. He said, "She's the woman who lost everything to her own pride." That line spread like wildfire. People quoted it under every post, every article, every photo still lingering from her academic days. Delilah tried to fight back, at first closing her accounts, releasing a brief statement about emotional exhaustion, but the tide was too strong. Her university cut all ties. Her colleagues stopped replying to messages, and parents at her old school whispered when her name came up. In the world she had once ruled with polished words and perfect posture, she had become an exile. Weeks later, Ryder handed me an envelope with my name written in neat handwriting. It was a letter from Delilah. Her words were shaky, full of apologies that felt more like confessions than excuses. "I don't ask you to forgive me," she wrote. "I just want Aaron to know I loved him, even if I didn't know how to show it." I sat at the kitchen table reading it twice. The paper smelled faintly of cheap perfume, a ghost of the woman she used to be, composed, proud, desperate to appear flawless. When I finally reached for my pen, my response came naturally steady and brief. Forgiveness isn't for you, I wrote. It's for the child who deserves peace. I sealed the letter without a second thought and left it on the porch for Ryder to mail. The air outside was cool and clean, the sky washed blue after rain. For the first time, I felt no anger toward her, only the kind of sorrow that comes when karma does what people cannot, when truth finishes the story that vengeance never should. Justice had arrived the way it was meant to, public, undeniable, witnessed by many. It didn't need cruelty, only clarity. And somewhere, I believed Delilah had finally realized that losing everything wasn't punishment, it was consequence. Cameron showed up on my doorstep one quiet Sunday afternoon. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle, and Aaron was inside painting by the window. When I opened the door, my son stood there looking smaller than I remembered, the crisp suit, gone, replaced by a faded shirt and tired eyes that had finally learned humility. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he handed me a small box, and inside it was his work ID card and a folded resignation letter. I left the company, he said softly. I couldn't sit in that office anymore pretending everything was fine. His voice cracked on the last word. I've been wrong, Mom, for a long time. I stepped aside and let him in. The same kitchen that had once felt too quiet suddenly carried the weight of history, meals we used to share, arguments we never should have had, all the words left unsaid. He sat at the table, running his hands over the wood grain like a man trying to remember something familiar. I found a small place near here, he said after a while. I want to be close if you'll let me. I'm also seeing someone, a therapist. That caught my attention. He took a deep breath. It's for people like me. They call it a support group for passive enablers. People who didn't hurt anyone directly, but stood by and watched. His eyes filled with tears. I didn't protect Aaron. I didn't protect you. I thought silence was peace, but it was just cowardice. For a long moment, I said nothing. I had spent years wanting to hear him admit that, and now that he had, I only felt an ache, not of anger, but of release. I reached out, resting my hand over his. Son, I said quietly, learning to stand on the right side, that's the greatest inheritance a mother can leave her child. He nodded, his shoulders trembling. The tears came without resistance this time. I don't deserve forgiveness, he whispered. I squeezed his hand gently. Forgiveness isn't a gift to earn, I told him. It's a lesson to live by. He covered his face, crying openly, and for the first time since he was a boy, I saw my son, not the man who hid behind pride, but the one who still knew how to feel. Outside, the wind rustled through the lavender fields. Aaron's laughter drifted from the window, bright and innocent, a sound that felt like redemption. I looked at Cameron and thought maybe this was how healing began, not with grand gestures, but with the courage to come home. The house smelled like home again, the scent of fresh paint mixed with the soft sweetness of lavender, the kind that lingered on every breeze in Charleston. After everything that had happened, I had bought back the small cottage I once thought I'd outgrown. Its porch creaked the same way it did 30 years ago, and somehow, that sound felt like forgiveness. Aaron and I started rebuilding the garden together. He wore his little sun hat, his hands clumsy but determined as he pressed tiny seeds into the soil. Do you think the lavender will bloom again, Grandma? He asked one morning, his voice hopeful. It always does, I said. Lavender doesn't fear winter, it just waits for warmth. That became our rhythm mornings in the garden, afternoons at therapy evenings, filled with art supplies scattered across the table. His therapist said drawing helped him heal, so he drew everything: the dog, the garden, even me with my straw hat and shears. And in the bottom corner of every picture, he signed the same name, the silver finch. When I asked him why, he smiled shyly. Because the finch always finds its way out right. I nodded, my throat tightening. Yes, sweetheart, always. Weeks passed, and the world began to take notice. One afternoon, as we were walking home from his school, A photographer stopped us on the sidewalk. Aaron was holding my hand, swinging his backpack, laughing at something silly I'd said. The picture appeared online the next day, an old woman and her grandson walking side by side under the golden trees, their faces lit with the quiet peace that only comes after storms. It went viral. Thousands of people shared it with captions like, "Healing looks like this," and "Strength has no age." The local paper even called it a portrait of hope. A week later, I received a letter inviting me to speak at a national conference called Protect Our Children. They wanted me to share our story not as tragedy, but as proof that justice, compassion, and wisdom could coexist. I almost said no. I wasn't used to microphones or stages. But then Aaron said, "Grandma, you always tell me brave people speak up so others don't feel alone. You should go." So I did. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I spoke not as a hero, but as a grandmother who refused to give up. When I finished, the room rose in applause, not for me, but for what we all carried inside us, the belief that love at any age can still change a life. Ryder Cole was never one for attention. In all his years practicing law, he had built a reputation for being measured precise and quietly relentless, the kind of attorney who let evidence speak louder than emotion. But the Ellis case had changed something in him. A month after the verdict, he sat in his office overlooking the Charleston Harbor sunlight, spilling across stacks of files and law journals. He opened his laptop and began typing an article he had been thinking about for weeks. The title appeared on the screen, "When Justice Begins in the Heart of a Grandmother." He wrote not as a lawyer chasing a claim, but as a witness to something purer, a woman who refused to let age or fear silence her, who had used reason and compassion to protect a child. In the article, he described how the law could serve not only as punishment, but as a form of healing. Real justice, he wrote, isn't born in the courtroom. It begins in the human heart, in the courage to act when silence is easier. When the article was published, it spread quickly through legal circles, then beyond them. Ryder received emails from professors, judges, and social workers thanking him for reminding us why we chose this profession. But the letters that moved him most came from grandmothers, women who wrote about their own battles for custody, their quiet struggles to protect grandchildren caught in broken homes. Each message ended with some variation of the same line, "You gave us hope." One afternoon, a delivery arrived at his office, a small bouquet wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. Inside were delicate silver-tinged roses, their petals shimmering faintly in the light. A handwritten card read, "Thank you, Ryder, for helping us find our voice again." Underneath in Aaron's uneven handwriting were 3 simple words, "Silver Finch Bloom." He smiled, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't a legal term, but he understood its meaning perfectly. The finch had become a symbol of rebirth, of voices freed, of innocence reclaimed. For once, Ryder allowed himself to feel something beyond duty. He turned the card over in his hand and whispered, "Justice and mercy, maybe they're not so different after all." Later that week, he was invited to speak at a National Bar Association event. When he stepped onto the stage, he began not with law, but with gratitude. This case reminded me, he said, that the law's greatest power isn't in fear or punishment, but in kindness, guided by truth. That's what Mrs. Ellis taught us, and what every lawyer should remember. And in that moment, the courtroom veteran and the retired gardener were bound by something greater than victory, a quiet bridge between law and humanity, between justice and love. The morning light spilled softly across my desk, touching the worn pages of my journal. The lavender outside swayed gently in the breeze, their scent drifting through the open window. I picked up my pen, the same one I had used for years, and began to write the final entry in the notebook that had carried my fears, my anger, and finally, my peace. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise, or applause. Sometimes it grows quietly, like a seed, buried beneath winter soil, waiting for patience instead of praise. I wrote those words slowly, letting each letter settle into the paper. In a world so loud with opinions, silence had become my strength. From the porch, I could hear Aaron laughing. I turned my head and saw him standing in the middle of the garden, sunlight glinting off his hair. In his hands was a small silver paper bird, the same one we had folded together the night before. He held it up for a moment, whispering something only he could hear, then opened his hands. The paper finch caught the wind and rose, twirling upward in the golden sky. For a second, I forgot to breathe. It felt like watching every burden I'd carried, every sleepless night, every tear shed in fear, lift away into the light. Aaron turned to me, his smile wide, free. "It's flying Grandma!" he shouted. "Yes," I whispered. "It's finally free." I closed the journal, resting my hand on its cover. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt alive with laughter, with memory, with the kind of love that doesn't ask to be understood, only protected. And then in my mind, I spoke to whoever might be listening. Perhaps another grandmother, a mother, or even a stranger somewhere who had once been told her love was too much. If you've ever been told not to care, don't believe it. Real love always finds a way back. Even when silenced, it waits. Even when forgotten, it endures. The wind picked up again, carrying the silver finch higher, until it was just a shimmer against the sun. I watched until it disappeared, smiling as I whispered, "Where there is truth, there will always be justice."